The crimson sun hung low over Redemption Canyon, casting long shadows across the dusty landscape as Caleb Hawkins's scarred hands moved with practiced precision over the ancient Winchester rifle. His weathered fingers, gnarled from years of both cavalry service and gunsmithing, traced the intricate modifications he'd made to the weapon. Each engraved line, each filed notch, and each hand-polished surface represented thousands of hours of painstaking craftsmanship. Outlaws had laughed at his seemingly obsolete weapon, not realizing it had been transformed into something that defied the very laws of marksmanship, a rifle that never missed, no matter the distance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old pine workbench beneath Caleb had borne witness to decades of such work. Cavalry equipment repaired during wartime, ranch tools fixed by day, and in the solitude of evening, firearms transformed into something far beyond their original specifications. The small workshop stood at the edge of his property, deliberately positioned away from his modest ranch house, a calculated distance meant to separate two different lives. A familiar pain shot through his mangled left leg, the damage intensifying. As storm clouds gathered on the distant horizon, the old war wound never allowed him to forget what he'd sacrificed on the battlefield, or the exceptional skills he'd developed to compensate for his limitations. As daylight faded, Caleb lit the oil lamp hanging above his workbench, its golden glow illuminating a wall lined with specialized tools that most gunsmiths wouldn't recognize. Tools Caleb had crafted himself for work that demanded perfection. From the main house, a dinner bell rang, his daughter Sarah calling him to the table. Caleb carefully returned the Winchester to its custom-built case, covering it with a faded cavalry blanket before reaching for his hand-carved walking stick. Some possessions were better kept separate from family meals. Some abilities were better left undiscussed in polite company. The approaching storm carried more threats for Redemption Canyon than just thunder and lightning. As Caleb limped his way through the gathering darkness toward the warm lights of his ranch house, he couldn't have known that a notorious gang was already planning to test just how far a crippled veteran would go to protect what was his. The morning dew sparkled across the grazing pastures surrounding Caleb Hawkins' ranch, catching the first rays of sunlight like scattered diamonds. At 62, Caleb had risen before dawn for as long as he could remember, despite the protests from his damaged leg. The day ahead demanded attention to the southern fence line, but first came his morning ritual. In the kitchen, Caleb brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead while his 23-year-old daughter Sarah prepared a hearty breakfast. The ranch house kitchen revealed signs of both frontier simplicity and meticulous care. Hand-hewn floor planks, worn smooth from decades of use, sturdy chairs gathered around a solid oak table, and windows that gleamed despite the aging wooden frames that held them. Marshall Jensen passed through the Franklin Ranch yesterday, Sarah mentioned, placing a plate of bacon and eggs before her father. Thought you should know he's tracking the Blackwell gang. Says they crossed the state line 3 days ago and are headed this way. Caleb nodded, a flicker of concern crossing his otherwise composed expression. The Blackwells don't leave witnesses, he replied, his voice carrying the rough texture of a man who'd seen too much blood spilled on too many battlefields. The name Blackwell carried weight throughout the territory. 5 brothers who'd transformed from cattle rustlers to murderous outlaws after the war, leaving a trail of burned homesteads and grieving families across 3 states. The Franklins' ranch lay 5 miles west, one of the few neighboring properties whose owners still made regular visits to the Hawkins homestead. Most of Redemption Canyon's inhabitants maintained a respectful distance from Caleb, not from dislike, but from an unspoken wariness they couldn't quite articulate, especially among those who'd heard whispered stories about his time in the war. After Breakfast. Caleb leaned heavily on his walking stick as he made his way across the yard to review the day's work with his two ranch hands. At the corral, Miguel Ortiz and young Billy Cooper waited, already saddling horses for the day's fence mending. "South boundary needs attention," Caleb instructed, gesturing toward the distant mesa with his walking stick. "Creek flooded during last week's rain, probably washed out a section near the cottonwoods." Miguel, who'd worked the Hawkins Ranch for nearly 14 years, nodded with silent understanding. At 45, he'd earned Caleb's trust through reliability and an uncanny ability to anticipate the old veteran's needs before they were voiced. "Will you be riding into town later, Mr. Hawkins?" Miguel asked, adjusting the saddle straps on. "His paint horse, need to pick up supplies from Whitaker's," Caleb confirmed, "should be back before sundown." What remained unspoken was Miguel's real question, whether Caleb would be stopping by his gunsmith workshop in town. The relationship between Caleb and Theodore Reynolds, Redemption Canyon's official gunsmith, carried an edge of professional rivalry that neither man publicly acknowledged. Caleb limped toward the weathered buckboard wagon that had served the ranch for over a decade, its sun-bleached wood telling stories of countless journeys across the rugged landscape. As he reached for the reins, Sarah emerged from the house, her determined expression suggesting she had no intention of letting her father make the journey alone. "I need fabric for the quilting circle," she announced, climbing onto the wagon seat without waiting for her father's approval. "And Sheriff Rawlins asked if I'd check if his special order of ammunition arrived on yesterday's stage." Caleb said nothing, but the slight nod acknowledged both his daughter's independence and his quiet appreciation for her company. Sarah had grown up without a mother, Elizabeth Hawkins having passed during a fever outbreak that had swept through the territory when Sarah was just 4. In the years since, father and daughter had formed a bond built on few words but deep understanding. The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking as they pulled away from the ranch house. Caleb's eyes methodically scanned the boundaries of his property, noting fences that needed repair, calculating days until cattle would need moving to fresh grazing land, and lingering momentarily on the distant workshop where he spent his evenings. Redemption. Canyons spread before them as they crested the first hill, a patchwork of ranches and untamed wilderness nestled between towering mesas. The town itself sat at the canyon's heart, a collection of wooden buildings whose weathered facades reflected the harsh realities of frontier life. Population 617 proclaimed the faded sign that had welcomed visitors since before Caleb had settled. "In the territory after the war, heard there are strangers in town," Sarah remarked, breaking the comfortable silence as they approached the outskirts. "Sheriff Rawlins mentioned it when he rode past the Jackson place yesterday. Said they've been asking questions." Caleb's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "What kind of questions?" "About local businesses, about who owns what." "A land," Sarah hesitated before adding, "and about you, Pa." The wagon slowed as they approached Redemption Canyon's main street. The town had changed little in the 20 years since Caleb had arrived with a wounded leg and a baby daughter. Whitaker's General Store still anchored the north end. The Silver Spur Saloon continued serving the same watered-down whiskey, and Dawson's Livery remained the only place within 30 miles to get quality horseshoes. What had changed was the world beyond Redemption Canyon. The railroad was pushing relentlessly westward, bringing with it land speculators and mining interests. Cattle barons had begun consolidating smaller ranches throughout the territory, and the slow erosion of frontier independence had become a steady tide threatening to reshape the canyon's way of life. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Whitaker's, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "I'll get the supplies," he said. "Meet you at Munro's in 30 minutes." Sarah nodded, understanding her father's need for solitude when conducting certain business. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Caleb watched her walk toward the dress shop, noting how many passers-by greeted her warmly. His daughter had inherited her mother's natural charm in social situations, a quality Caleb had always lacked. Inside Whitaker's, the familiar smell of leather, tobacco, and coffee greeted him. Samuel Whitaker looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face creasing into a restrained smile. "Caleb," he acknowledged. "Got your order in the back, and something else you might want to see." Caleb followed the storekeeper to the rear storeroom, where his regular supplies waited alongside a package wrapped in oilcloth. "Came in on yesterday's stage," Samuel explained, gesturing to the package. "Those special order parts you asked about 4 months back. Almost forgot you'd requested them." Unwrapping the oilcloth revealed precision-machined components that had nothing to do with cattle ranching. Caleb examined them carefully, noting the exceptional quality of craftsmanship. "These will do," he said simply, rewrapping the components before placing them in his jacket pocket. "Add it to my account." Samuel nodded, helping Caleb load the ranch supplies onto a handcart. "Those men staying at the Wayfarer Hotel," he said quietly as they worked. "They've been asking about land purchases and about who around here knows firearms." Caleb's face remained impassive. "Lots of ranchers know firearms. Not like you do." Samuel hesitated before continuing. "They specifically mentioned your name, asked if you still did special work." For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the cartwheel as they moved toward the front of the store. Caleb finally broke the silence. "Been 15 years since I've done anything but ranching and basic repairs." "You and I both know that's not entirely true," Samuel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Outside, Caleb loaded the supplies into his wagon, his mind processing the implications of strangers asking about him. He'd been careful over the years, maintaining a separation between his public life as a rancher with a gunsmithing hobby and his private work perfecting firearms with modifications that went far beyond conventional understanding. The promise he'd made after the incident that had cost him full use of his leg had been simple: no more custom work for those who used firearms for anything but legitimate purposes. That line had been clearly drawn after the bloodshed that had nearly cost him his life and had taken something far more precious. As Caleb turned toward Monroe's Mercantile to meet Sarah, he noticed 3 unfamiliar men outside the bank, well-dressed, figures whose tailored clothing and confident postures marked them as outsiders. One of them, a tall man with silver-streaked hair, watched Caleb with particular interest. Inside Monroe's, Sarah was examining fabric patterns when Caleb found her. The store's owner, Martha Monroe, greeted him warmly. "Caleb, just the man I wanted to see. That trigger assembly you repaired for my Henry works better than when it was new," she exclaimed. "My brother's planning to use it for the sharpshooting contest next month." Caleb acknowledged her praise with a nod. "Simple fix. The spring just needed proper tensioning. Nothing simple about your work," Martha countered. "Everyone knows that." Sarah finished selecting her fabric, and as they prepared to leave, Caleb noticed the 3 strangers had positioned themselves near his wagon. There would be no avoiding the interaction he'd been anticipating since hearing of their presence. In town, outside, the tallest of the men stepped forward as Caleb approached. "Mr. Hawkins," he introduced himself with a tip of his hat. "Victor Holloway, these are my associates, Mr. Parker and Mr. Reeves." Caleb said nothing, merely waiting for the man to reveal his purpose. "We represent Western Territories Development," Holloway continued smoothly. "Perhaps you've heard of our operations in neighboring counties. We've been acquiring properties throughout the region." "Not interested in selling," Caleb replied flatly, moving to load Sarah's packages into the wagon. Holloway's practiced smile didn't falter. We haven't even discussed figures, Mr. Hawkins. I think you'll find our offer quite generous for land that's becoming increasingly difficult to ranch profitably. Caleb turned to face the man fully, his damaged leg forcing him to lean heavily on his walking stick. The Hawkins Ranch has been profitable for 15 years, will be for at least 15 more. The man called Parker spoke up, his voice carrying a harder edge than Holloway's polished tones. Times are changing, Mr. Hawkins. Small operations like yours are becoming unsustainable with the railroad pushing through. Sarah stepped closer to her father, her hand resting protectively on his arm. Holloway noticed the gesture and shifted his approach. "We've heard you have other skills besides ranching," he said, his voice lowering. "Skills with firearms, modifications, improvements, the kind of work that certain collectors might pay handsomely for." The dusty main street of Redemption Canyon suddenly seemed very quiet, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Caleb's expression remained unchanged, but Sarah felt the tension in his arm. "Don't know what you're talking about," Caleb stated flatly. "I fix ranch equipment, occasionally repair a neighbor's hunting rifle. Nothing special." Reeves, the third man, laughed softly. "That's not what we've heard, Mr. Hawkins. In fact, we've been told your work is quite exceptional, unique even. The kind of craftsmanship that might be worth more than this entire ranch's annual yield." Caleb's grip tightened on his walking stick. "Then you've been misled." His voice carried no emotion, but his eyes had hardened to flint. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to attend to." As Caleb helped Sarah onto the wagon, Holloway placed a business card on the vehicle's seat. "Think about it, Mr. Hawkins. We'll be in town for the week. Our offer for both the land and your services remains open." The drive back to the ranch passed in tense silence. Only when they turned onto the private road leading to the Hawkins property did Sarah speak. "They know, don't they, about what you used to do before?" "They think they know," Caleb replied, his weathered hands gripping the reins tightly. "Are they dangerous, Pa?" Caleb considered the question carefully before answering. "Men who value money over everything else are always dangerous, Sarah. But they're not the kind I haven't handled before." As they approached the ranch house, Caleb noticed Miguel waiting by the corral, his posture suggesting urgent news. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop and lowered himself carefully down, his leg particularly painful after the tension of the encounter in town. "Riders along the north property line," Miguel reported without preamble. "Two men taking photographs and measurements. When I approached, they claimed to be from the county surveyor's office." "Did they show identification?" Caleb asked, already knowing the answer. "Nothing official," Miguel confirmed. "Told them they were trespassing. They left, but didn't seem too concerned about it." Caleb nodded his thanks, his mind already calculating what these developments meant. Corporate interests didn't send men like Holloway unless they were serious about acquisition. They didn't conduct unofficial surveys unless they had specific plans for the land. And they certainly didn't mention his former gunsmithing work unless they had information they shouldn't have. "Get word to Sheriff Rawlins," Caleb instructed Miguel. "He should know we've had trespassers." Turning to Sarah, he added, "And tell Billy to ride over to the Franklin Ranch. Tell Jacob Franklin to spread the word. Watch for strangers on any of the canyon properties." As Miguel and Sarah moved to carry out his instructions, Caleb limped toward his private workshop, the building standing apart from the other ranch structures, a deliberate distance that had always defined the separation between his public life and private work. Inside, Caleb lit the oil lamp and moved to the far wall, where a weathered cabinet stood locked. The key he removed from around his neck opened not just the cabinet, but a chapter of his life he'd kept closed for 15 years. Within the cabinet hung 3 rifles, each one a masterpiece of modification and precision that went far beyond conventional gunsmithing. These weren't merely repaired or improved firearms, they were transformations, weapons whose capabilities had been enhanced through techniques Caleb had developed through decades of obsessive refinement. The Winchester he lifted. From its brackets appeared unremarkable at first glance, a standard model 1866 with a worn wooden stock. Only closer inspection revealed the subtle modifications, the perfectly balanced weight distribution, the custom sight alignment, the precisely altered trigger mechanism, and the specialized rifling pattern that made the weapon capable of accuracy, that defied conventional ballistics. Caleb placed the Winchester on his workbench alongside the components Samuel Whitaker had provided. For 15 years, he'd limited his work to minor repairs and basic modifications, ethical compromises that allowed him to maintain his skills while honoring the promise he'd made after the incident that had cost him so much. The arrival of Holloway and his associates changed that calculation. Caleb understood the language of threat, even when couched in business terminology. He'd encountered men like them before, in another lifetime, men who saw skills like his as commodities to be acquired, controlled, and exploited. As evening shadows lengthened across Redemption Canyon, Caleb Hawkins began the meticulous process of preparing for what he knew was coming. His damaged leg throbbed with remembered pain, a physical reminder of the cost of underestimating men driven by greed. It was a mistake he wouldn't make twice. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered over the mesas. The weather was changing in Redemption Canyon, and change rarely came without consequence. The following morning brought heavy storm clouds that hung over Redemption Canyon like an omen. Caleb awoke before dawn, his damaged leg unusually stiff as he moved through his morning routine. Years of adapting to the injury had taught him efficiency in movement, each action carefully calculated to minimize pain while maintaining dignity. From his bedroom window, he surveyed his property with the tactical assessment of a man who had spent years reading both landscapes and people's intentions. Sheriff Eli Rawlins arrived just as the household finished breakfast. His bay mare lathered, him from a hard ride. At 46, Rawlins carried himself with the quiet authority of a lawman who had earned respect through action rather than talk. He had served as Redemption Canyon sheriff for 8 years after returning from a stint with the Texas Rangers. "Caleb," Rawlins greeted, removing his hat as he stepped onto the porch. The two men had history that preceded Caleb's arrival in Redemption Canyon, bonds forged during the war when they'd served in the same cavalry unit. "Coffee?" Caleb offered, gesturing toward the pot Sarah had left warming on the stove. "Wouldn't." "You turn it down," Rawlins replied, settling into a porch chair as Sarah brought out 2 steaming mugs before excusing herself to tend to the chickens. When they were alone, Rawlins leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the isolation of the ranch. "House. Ran background checks on your visitors. Victor Holloway is Chief Land Agent for Western Territories Development. The others have more complicated histories." Caleb waited silently, knowing Rawlins would continue without prompting. "Parker has military service, cavalry like us, dishonorable discharge after Gettysburg. Records suggest he was involved in an incident with civilians." Rawlins sipped his coffee before continuing. "Reeves is officially their financial representative, but he's been investigated twice for land fraud schemes in Colorado. Charges never stuck." Caleb absorbed this information, his weathered face revealing nothing. "And their interest in Redemption Canyon?" Rawlins swirled the remaining coffee in his mug. "Officially, they're acquiring properties for a cattle operation. Unofficially," he paused, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a folded document. "This telegram came from a contact in Denver yesterday. Western Territories is a front company for the Crosswell Mining Syndicate." Caleb unfolded the telegram, his eyes narrowing. As he read, "Gold, Silver, Rawlins corrected. Geological surveys indicate a potentially substantial vein running right through your north ridge, the same area where Miguel spotted those surveyors yesterday. This explained the sudden interest in land that had been considered marginal for anything but modest ranching. What it didn't explain was Holloway's specific interest in Caleb's gunsmithing abilities. That's not the whole story, though, Rawlins continued, setting down his mug. Holloway's been asking particular questions around town about you, about work you did before the incident, Caleb finished for him. Rawlins nodded grimly. He seems especially interested in custom firearms work, mentioned collectors willing to pay premium prices for specialized modifications. A heavy silence settled between them, filled with unspoken history. Rawlins had been one of the few people who knew the full truth about Caleb's past, about the precision gunsmithing work that had gained him a reputation in certain circles during the war, and about the tragedy that had led him to abandon that work 15 years ago. I made my position clear yesterday, Caleb said finally. Not interested in selling the land, not interested in custom work. I figured as much, Rawlins replied. But these aren't men who take rejection well, Caleb, especially when there's this much money involved. Caleb's expression hardened. I've dealt with their kind before. That's what worries me, Rawlins said, standing to leave. Last time you dealt with their kind, it cost you your leg and Elizabeth her life. The mention of his late wife caused Caleb to flinch, a barely perceptible reaction that anyone else would have missed. Rawlins, however, had known Caleb since they were young men riding patrol together along the Missouri border. I'll increase patrols near your property, the sheriff continued, replacing his hat. But my jurisdiction has limits, Caleb, same as my manpower. Appreciated, Caleb responded, rising carefully with the aid of his walking stick. But I can handle what comes. Rawlins paused at the porch steps. Just make sure what comes doesn't cross legal lines I can't ignore. After the sheriff departed, Caleb made his way to the corral where Miguel was breaking in a new Mustang. The ranch hand looked up expectantly. Take the day off, Caleb instructed. Go check on your sister's place. Make sure she hasn't had any visitors of her own. Miguel nodded in understanding. His sister's small homestead bordered Hawkins' property to the east and would be equally attractive to Western Territory's expansion plans. What about the north fence? Miguel asked, securing the Mustang's lead rope to the corral post. Weather's turning anyway, Caleb replied, glancing at the darkening sky. Work can wait a day. Once Miguel had departed, Caleb returned to the house to find Sarah preparing to leave for her twice-weekly teaching position at the Redemption Canyon schoolhouse. Maybe stay home today, he suggested, trying to keep his tone casual. Sarah's eyes narrowed with the perceptiveness that often reminded Caleb of her mother. Because of those men in town? Just a precaution. The children are expecting me, Pa, she countered, her gentle stubbornness another inherited trait. Mrs. Henderson needs help with the younger students' reading lessons. Caleb recognized the determination in her expression, the same determination that had helped her build a life defined by more than the tragedy that had claimed her mother. He nodded reluctantly. Take the shotgun from behind the kitchen door, he conceded, and have Jacob Franklin escort you home after school. The compromise satisfied them both, though Caleb watched her departure with unease settling in his chest, like a physical weight. Once Sarah's horse had disappeared down the trail, he took his walking stick and made his way to the workshop. Inside, Caleb unlocked a second cabinet, one even more carefully secured than the first. From it, he removed a worn leather journal, its pages filled with detailed diagrams, measurements and formulas compiled over decades of experimentation. This journal contained the true extent of his gunsmithing innovations, modifications that went far beyond what conventional gunsmiths considered possible. Caleb had discovered through years of obsessive refinement that firearms could be tuned. Like musical instruments, their components harmonized to achieve accuracy that seemed to defy physics. The balance point of a rifle, the precise tension of springs, the specific composition of metal alloys used in firing pins, all could be adjusted in ways that transformed standard weapons into precision instruments. This knowledge had once brought him recognition among a select clientele, sportsmen seeking competition advantages, collectors appreciating his artistry, and eventually men whose purposes were less innocent. The latter had led to the tragedy that changed everything. Caleb set the journal on his workbench and opened it to diagrams he hadn't reviewed in 15 years. The specialized sight alignment system he'd developed that allowed for unprecedented accuracy over extreme distances. The trigger mechanism modifications that enabled consistent pressure and breakpoints. The balance adjustments that compensated for his leg injury, allowing him to maintain accuracy despite his physical limitation. As he reviewed his notes, Caleb heard horses approaching, multiple riders moving faster than anyone with legitimate business would travel on a ranch road. He moved to the workshop window, watching as 3 black horses pulled up to his ranch house. Victor Holloway dismounted first, accompanied by Parker and Reeves. From the other horses, 4 more men appeared, their posture and alertness marking them as hired guns. Caleb carefully closed the journal and returned it to its hiding place before retrieving the modified Winchester from its bracket. He loaded it methodically, each cartridge placed with deliberate care. Then, leaning heavily on his walking stick, he made his way toward the approaching confrontation. Holloway stood on the ranch house porch, examining the property with the evaluating eye of a man already calculating its worth. When he spotted Caleb emerging from the distant workshop, a satisfied smile crossed his face. "Mr. Hawkins," he called out as Caleb approached, "I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit. We were in the area and thought we might continue our conversation from yesterday." Caleb stopped at a careful distance, the Winchester held casually in his left hand, his right maintaining a firm grip on his walking stick. The positioning appeared natural, but allowed him immediate access to the weapon if needed. "Nothing to continue," Caleb replied evenly. "Position hasn't changed." Parker stepped forward, his stance subtly aggressive. "Circumstances have, though. We've received updated geological surveys." He held up a folder. "Your property's value has increased significantly overnight." "Not for sale," Caleb repeated, his voice flat. "At any price." Holloway sighed theatrically. "Mr. Hawkins, I admire your attachment to your family legacy, truly I do. But surely you understand that progress requires change. The resources beneath your land could benefit countless people. Find your resources elsewhere." "Unfortunately, geology doesn't work that way," Holloway responded, his practiced patience showing signs of strain. "The deposits extend throughout the canyon, but the concentration, the economically viable concentration, centers on your north ridge." Caleb remained silent, his stillness conveying more than words could express. "Let's discuss your other talents," Holloway continued, changing tactics. "We have clients who would pay exceptionally well for custom firearms work of the caliber you're known for. Such arrangements could allow you to maintain ownership of portions of your property while still accommodating our mining operations." "Not interested," Parker laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "A crippled old man living on a failing ranch, and he's not interested in more money than he's seen in his lifetime." He gestured toward Caleb's Winchester. "Probably thinks that antique gives him leverage." One of the hired guns snickered, emboldened by Parker's mockery. "Look at that ancient Winchester," the man commented. "Bet it couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, especially in those shaky hands." Caleb's expression remained impassive, though he noted which men were armed and how they carried their weapons. The hired guns wore holsters tied down, revealing their profession. Parker carried his revolver high on his hip, a position that telegraphed his military background. Reeves, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Mr. Hawkins, let's be reasonable. You're one man, an injured man with limited resources, facing a company with virtually unlimited ones. This doesn't need to become adversarial." "Too late for that," Caleb replied, his gaze shifting to the men who had laughed at his Winchester. "You're trespassing. Leave now." Holloway's facade of civility thinned. "Before we go, I should mention that we've already secured options on neighboring properties. The Franklin Ranch, for instance, signed preliminary agreements this morning." The mention of the Franklin property caused Caleb's first visible reaction, a slight tightening around his eyes. Jacob Franklin was Sarah's closest friend and the son of Caleb's oldest ally in the canyon. If the Franklins had indeed signed agreements with Western Territories, the situation was more advanced than he had realized. "And the Ortiz homestead," Holloway continued, watching Caleb carefully. "Miguel's sister was quite receptive to our offer, particularly after we explained how isolated her farm would become once surrounded by our operations. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Caleb understood the message clearly. Resistance would affect not just him, but those he was connected to. The strategy was familiar. Isolate, pressure, exploit vulnerabilities. He'd seen it before, in another context with different players, but the same underlying ruthlessness. 2 days, Caleb stated, his voice carrying quiet authority. 2 days. To leave Redemption Canyon. After that, whatever happens is on you. Parker stepped forward aggressively, but Holloway placed a restraining hand on his associate's arm. "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Hawkins," Holloway observed, his tone almost curious. "Surely a law-abiding citizen such as yourself wouldn't be threatening legitimate businessmen conducting lawful negotiations." "Not a threat," Caleb clarified. "A deadline." The hired guns shifted uncomfortably, reading something in Caleb's demeanor that their employers missed, the absolute conviction behind his words. "We'll be in touch again soon," Holloway concluded, gesturing for his entourage to return to their horses. "I suggest you use the time to reconsider your position." As they rode away, Caleb remained standing in the yard, the encounter having confirmed what he already suspected. Western Territories wasn't merely interested in land acquisition. They were systematically targeting Redemption Canyon for complete control, using whatever pressure tactics necessary to achieve their goal. The mockery of his Winchester and physical limitations didn't concern him. Such underestimation had served him well in the past. What troubled him was Holloway's mention of the Franklin and Ortiz properties. If Western Territories had already secured those options, they were moving faster and more aggressively than anticipated. Caleb returned to his workshop, his mind calculating options and contingencies. The modified Winchester he placed back in its bracket, but not before checking its mechanisms one final time. The weapon those men had laughed at represented thousands of hours of precision engineering, modifications invisible to the untrained eye that transformed a standard rifle into something with capabilities that defied conventional expectations. As he worked, Caleb's thoughts turned to Elizabeth. It had been 15 years since the incident that took her life and left him permanently injured. An accident, he'd later learned, was no accident at all. The circumstances had been different, the players unknown to him then, but the underlying dynamic was identical, powerful interests eliminating obstacles to their ambitions. The mistake he'd made then was believing that his specialized skills would remain private, that the custom work he did for competitive shooters and discerning collectors could be separated from those who would use such advantages for darker purposes. Elizabeth had paid the ultimate price for that naivety. Caleb opened a hidden compartment beneath his workbench, removing a steel box that hadn't seen daylight in 15 years. Inside lay newspaper clippings alongside an official inquest report. The headlines told a story the authorities had never fully investigated. Gunsmith's wife killed in mysterious explosion. Questions remain in Hawkins' workshop accident. Authorities rule fatal blast, accidental, despite inconsistencies. Beneath these, a single photograph showed Caleb with Elizabeth, both smiling beside a display of his award-winning custom firearms. The image had been taken 3 days before the explosion that destroyed his original workshop, killed Elizabeth, and left Caleb with a permanently damaged leg. The official investigation had concluded that a faulty oil lamp caused the explosion. Caleb had known differently, but lacked proof until 6 months later, when a dying man confessed to planting the explosive device. The man had been hired by competitors seeking Caleb's proprietary modification techniques he had refused to sell. By then, Caleb had already relocated to Redemption Canyon, rebuilt his life around ranching rather than gunsmithing, and created a new identity as a reclusive widower with a hobby-level interest in firearms. The specialized work he continued in secret was limited to personal projects and occasional assistance to veterans through Sheriff Rawlins. Now, as he studied the old newspaper clippings, Caleb recognized that he faced a similar threat. Different players, but the same fundamental dynamics. Western territories wanted what he wouldn't willingly give, and they weren't likely to accept rejection. The sound of a horse approaching pulled Caleb from his dark memories. Through the workshop window, he recognized Sarah's Pinto mare returning from the school earlier than expected. Her expression as she hurried toward the workshop told him something was wrong. "Pa!" she called as she entered, her voice tense with urgency. "There's trouble in town. Those men, Holloway and his people, they've set up an office in the old Jenkins building. They're pressuring everyone to sign land option agreements." Caleb listened as Sarah detailed what she'd learned. Western Territories representatives had approached every property owner in Redemption Canyon with aggressive offers. Those who hesitated were subtly threatened with isolation, economic pressure, or mentions of government condemnation proceedings for the railroad's benefit. Most troubling, they'd been asking specific questions about Caleb's history before coming. "Unto Redemption Canyon. Jacob says his father didn't sign anything," Sarah added, contradicting Holloway's earlier claim. "They refused outright, just like we did, but they're worried Western Territories has already purchased the Wilson property on their eastern border." This confirmed Caleb's suspicion that Holloway had lied about the Franklin agreements, a tactic designed to create a sense of isolation and inevitability. It was the same strategy that had been used against him years ago, in another place, with devastating consequences. "What are we going to do, Pa?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite her obvious concern. Caleb looked at his daughter, seeing Elizabeth's determination in her eyes, her refusal to be intimidated. He had tried to keep Sarah separate from the darker aspects of his past, to protect her from the knowledge that had proven so dangerous. But circumstances no longer allowed for such separation. "There's something you need to know," Caleb said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of unshared history. "About what I used to do, about why we came to Redemption Canyon, about how your mother really died." Outside, thunder rumbled as the delayed storm finally broke over Redemption Canyon. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, washing across the ranch in cleansing torrents. Inside the workshop, Caleb Hawkins prepared to reveal the truth he'd protected for 15 years, a truth that would forever change his daughter's understanding of her family legacy and of the extraordinary skills her father had hidden beneath the identity of a simple rancher with a damaged leg. Rain pounded against the workshop's wooden roof as Caleb led Sarah to the worn chair beside his workbench. The oil lamp cast long shadows across the walls, illuminating tools and components organized with military precision. This space had always been off-limits to her, not explicitly forbidden, but understood to be her father's private domain. Now, as she sat surrounded by the evidence of his hidden craft, Sarah realized how little she truly knew about the man who had raised her. "After your mother died," Caleb began, his voice steady despite the pain these memories carried, "I told you it was an accident, an oil lamp that caused an explosion in my workshop." Sarah nodded. The tragedy had occurred when she was just 4 years old. Too young to remember her mother, except through photographs and stories. Too young to question the circumstances. "That was a lie," Caleb continued, retrieving the steel box from beneath his workbench. "Not to deceive you, but to protect you. The truth has always been a dangerous thing in our family." He placed the box before her, its contents telling a story, so different from the one she'd been raised with that Sarah felt as if the ground beneath her had suddenly shifted. The newspaper clippings, the inquest report with its obvious inconsistencies, the photograph of her parents in a workshop far more elaborate than this one, all painted a picture of a life she'd never known existed. "Before we came to Redemption Canyon, I wasn't just a gunsmith," Caleb explained. "I was an innovator. I developed modifications that changed what firearms could do. Improvements in accuracy, reliability, and performance that went beyond what conventional gunsmithing considered possible." His hands, weathered and scarred from years of precision work, moved with practiced efficiency as he unlocked the cabinet containing his most closely guarded creations. From it, he removed not just the modified Winchester she'd seen before, but 2 additional firearms, a Sharps rifle of unfamiliar design and a Colt revolver that appeared deceptively standard until one noticed the subtle alterations to its grip and cylinder. "These aren't just customized weapons, Sarah. They represent principles of ballistics and engineering that I discovered through years of experimentation. Principles that certain people very much wanted to acquire, and still do." Sarah studied the firearms with new eyes, seeing beyond their physical forms to what they represented. "Mom's death wasn't an accident, was it?" Caleb shook his head, pain briefly visible before his expression returned to its customary stoicism. 6 months after we moved here, a man confessed on his deathbed. He'd been hired to plant the explosive device. The target was me and my research. "Oh, journals. Your mother wasn't supposed to be in the workshop that day." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof in a crescendo that matched the gravity of Caleb's revelation. "Who hired him?" Sarah asked, her voice surprisingly calm despite the shock of these revelations. "He claimed not to know, just described a businessman who paid in cash." Caleb placed the modified Winchester on the workbench. "But I've always had my suspicions." Sarah connected the pieces swiftly. "And now, Western Territories shows up asking specifically about your gunsmithing work. Too coincidental to be coincidence." "Holloway mentioned collectors interested in my modifications," Caleb confirmed, "but what they're really after is the principles behind them." Caleb opened his worn leather journal, revealing diagrams that looked more like advanced physics equations than gunsmithing notes. "This is what they want, Sarah, not just the finished products, but the knowledge of how to replicate them." Sarah studied the diagrams, her schoolteacher's mind recognizing the sophistication of the mathematics involved. Her father had an 8th-grade formal education, yet these pages contained theoretical ballistics work that would impress university professors. "These modifications," she said, gesturing toward the Winchester, "what exactly do they do?" Caleb picked up the rifle, his movements displaying the practiced familiarity of a master with his creation. Conventional rifles lose accuracy over distance due to multiple factors: bullet drop, wind drift, barrel harmonics. Most marksmen compensate through calculation and adjustment. He traced the barely perceptible modifications to the barrel and sight system, This system uses a combination of specialized rifling patterns, harmonic dampening, and a proprietary method of weight distribution to maintain accuracy at ranges most experts would consider impossible. Sarah considered the implications. And the other weapons? The Sharps operates on similar principles, adapted for long-range precision. Caleb hesitated, then continued, The Colt represents something else entirely, a method of compensating. For physical limitations, understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. Your injury, Caleb nodded. After losing full use of my leg, conventional shooting stances became difficult. This design adjusts for the imbalance, redirecting forces to maintain stability despite the shooter's physical limitations. The innovation was both brilliant and deeply personal. But why hide all this, Pa? Your work could have helped others with disabilities, veterans, people injured like you. Caleb's expression darkened. Because the same principles that compensate for physical limitations can be applied in other ways. Military applications, specialized units, assassinations at previously impossible ranges. The weight of this statement settled in the workshop like a physical presence. When your mother died, Caleb continued, I made a choice to disappear into the identity of a reclusive rancher with a hobby-level interest in firearms, to protect you, and to ensure this knowledge wouldn't be used for the wrong purposes. Sarah processed this information, connecting it to their current situation. And now, Western Territories wants what you wouldn't give them 15 years ago. Caleb nodded. Holloway isn't just a land agent, he's hunting technology that was buried with Elizabeth. The rain had begun to ease, the storm passing over Redemption Canyon toward the eastern plains. In its wake, an expectant silence filled the air, the calm that follows revelation but precedes decision. What are we going to do? Sarah asked, the question carrying more weight now that she understood the true stakes. Caleb returned the modified weapons to their cabinet, locking it securely. First, we need to understand exactly what we're facing. Western Territories isn't acting alone. Companies like that always have local collaborators. You think someone in Redemption Canyon is working with them? Information about my past was closely guarded. For Holloway to know as much as he does, someone who knows me had to talk. Caleb's expression had shifted from revelatory to strategic, his mind working through possibilities. Tomorrow I need you to do something for me, Sarah. She nodded without hesitation, her father's daughter in more ways than she'd previously understood. Go to the county records office, check land transfers and option agreements from the past 6 months. See who's been selling and to whom. Pay particular attention to properties that border ours. You think they're trying to surround us? Standard tactic, Caleb confirmed. Isolate the target, eliminate support networks, then increase pressure, until resistance becomes untenable. Sarah absorbed these instructions with a newfound appreciation for her father's tactical thinking. This wasn't just a rancher protecting his land. This was a man who had spent years anticipating and countering threats. While you're in town, Caleb continued, pay attention to interactions. Who's meeting with Western Territories representatives? Who's suddenly spending money they didn't have before? You want me to identify their local collaborator? Caleb nodded, pride briefly visible in his eyes at his daughter's quick grasp of the situation. Be careful, though. Don't draw attention. If Holloway realizes you're investigating, it could accelerate their timeline. The practical strategy session was interrupted by the sound of an approaching rider, a galloping horse that both recognized as Sheriff Rawlins's bay mare. Caleb carefully relocked the cabinets containing his most sensitive equipment before they left the workshop to meet him. Rawlins stood beside his horse, his expression conveying the urgency that had brought him back to the Hawkins ranch so soon after his morning visit. Rain had plastered his duster to his body, suggesting he'd been riding hard through the downpour. Rather than waiting it out, you've had visitors, he stated without preamble, gesturing toward the muddy hoofprints leading to the ranch house. Holloway and his associates, Caleb confirmed, made their position clear. Rawlins removed his hat, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. They've been busy in town, too. Set up an operations center in the Jenkins building, brought in more personnel, hired guns that make Parker look civilized. Sarah and Caleb exchanged glances, silently acknowledging that the situation was escalating faster than anticipated. That's not why I'm here, though, Rawlins continued, his voice dropping. There was an incident at the Franklin Ranch about an hour ago. Jacob's father was found unconscious in their barn. Someone worked him over pretty good. Sarah gasped. Robert. Franklin was not only Caleb's closest ally in Redemption Canyon, but also Jacob's father and the third-generation owner of the property adjoining the Hawkins Ranch. How bad? Caleb asked, his voice tight. Bad enough, Rawlins replied grimly. Broken ribs, concussion. Doc Bennett's with him now. Don't know if he'll make it through the night. Caleb's hand tightened on his walking stick. Jacob, shaken up, says his father refused to sign Western Territory's option agreement this morning, even after they increased their offer. This happened a few hours later while Jacob was in town picking up supplies. Caleb absorbed this information, his expression hardening into something Sarah had never seen before. A cold calculation that transformed his weather-worn features into something almost predatory. Any witnesses? He asked. Rawlins shook his head. Convenient timing. Most of Redemption Canyon was attending the town meeting Holloway requested to discuss economic development opportunities. His tone made clear his opinion of such euphemisms. While everyone was distracted by promises of jobs and prosperity, someone nearly killed Robert Franklin. Caleb turned to Sarah. Check on Robert's condition, then contact Jacob. Tell him to come here. As Sarah moved toward the house, Rawlins stepped closer to Caleb, lowering his voice. This is escalating quickly, Caleb. Too quickly for normal corporate pressure tactics. Because it's not about land acquisition, Caleb replied. Not entirely. Rawlins studied his old friend's face, reading the confirmation of suspicions he'd harbored since Holloway's arrival. They know about your previous work, Caleb nodded once. Christ, Rawlins muttered. I'd hoped that chapter was buried for good. So did I. Caleb gazed toward his workshop, its weathered exterior disguising the secrets contained within. Holloway mentioned collectors interested in custom modifications. Parker and his hired guns carry themselves like ex-military. This isn't just about silver deposits. Rawlins's expression grew even more concerned. If they're who I think they are, they won't stop at intimidation, Caleb. Robert Franklin might be just the beginning. I know. Caleb's voice had taken on the quiet certainty that Rawlins recognized from years ago, the tone that had always preceded decisive action. That's why we need to move first. Before Rawlins could respond, Sarah returned from the house, her expression confirming the gravity of Robert Franklin's condition. Doc Bennett says it doesn't look good, she reported, her voice faltering briefly before she collected herself. Jacob's on his way here, should arrive within the hour. Rawlins replaced his hat, decision made. I'll increase patrols near your property, Caleb, but my jurisdiction and resources have limits. Understood, Caleb replied. Do what you can within those limits. As Rawlins departed, Sarah turned to her father, her eyes reflecting a determination inherited from both her parents. What now? Caleb gazed toward the distant road, the setting sun breaking through the post-storm clouds to cast long shadows across the land his family had worked for years. Now we prepare, he said simply, and we send a message. Inside the ranch house, Caleb moved with the efficiency of a man executing a long-considered contingency plan. From a concealed safe behind the kitchen fireplace, he removed documents and a significant amount of cash. Emergency resources positioned years ago for exactly this type of situation. Pack a bag, he instructed Sarah. Essentials only, enough for a few days. Sarah hesitated, understanding the implications. We're leaving? You are, Caleb clarified, temporarily. Once Jacob arrives, you'll go with him to his cousin's place in Silver Peak. Stay there until I contact you. I'm not leaving you alone to face this, Sarah protested, the stubborn set of her jaw reminiscent of Elizabeth. Caleb placed his hands gently on her shoulders, a rare physical gesture from a man who typically maintained emotional distance. This isn't about protecting you, Sarah. Not entirely. I need you in Silver Peak to coordinate certain arrangements, to be my eyes and ears outside Redemption Canyon, where Holloway doesn't have influence yet. The strategic logic behind this request silenced her objection. Caleb wasn't sending her away out of paternalistic protection. He was deploying her as a vital part of his response plan. What kind of arrangements? She asked. Contact Thomas Reynolds, Caleb replied, naming an old friend who'd once been his supplier for specialized materials. Tell him it's time to reactivate the workshop accounts, then reach out to Captain Michael Hargrove at the Territorial Marshal's office. He'll know what it means. Sarah nodded, recognizing names she'd heard in passing over the years, but never understood the significance of until now. Her father had maintained these connections like dormant assets, preserved for a contingency he hoped would never arise. And if Holloway's men come here while I'm gone? A cold smile touched Caleb's lips, an expression so unfamiliar that Sarah momentarily felt as if she were looking at a stranger. Let them come. The workshop is ready for visitors. As darkness settled over Redemption Canyon, Caleb Hawkins made final preparations in his workshop. The modified Winchester he placed in a specialized case designed for inconspicuous transport. The journal containing his proprietary techniques he secured in a waterproof container hidden beneath the workshop floor. Other components, the most unique and irreplaceable elements of his craft, he distributed throughout the property in locations only he knew. Jacob Franklin arrived as planned, his young face hardened by the day's events. At 26, he'd grown up alongside Sarah, the two families bound by proximity, shared values, and now shared enemies. "Pa's holding on," he reported grimly. "Doc says the next 12 hours will tell." Caleb placed a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder. "Robert's tougher than most. Focus on what needs doing now." Jacob nodded, composing himself. "Sheriff Rawlins told me to tell you that 6 more Western Territories men arrived in town this evening. They've taken rooms at the Wayfarer Hotel." Additional muscle, Caleb noted. "Holloway's preparing to escalate. What do you need me to do, Jacob?" "Take Sarah to my cousin's place in Silver Peak. Stay with her. Help her make certain contacts." Caleb handed him a sealed envelope, instructions inside. Memorize them, then destroy the paper. Jacob accepted the envelope with the seriousness the situation demanded. "And the ranch? Your property?" "I'll handle things here," Caleb replied, his tone ending further discussion on that point. As Sarah and Jacob prepared to depart, Caleb pulled his daughter aside for a final private word. "What I've shown you today," he said quietly, "what I've told you about my work, it's knowledge that carries responsibility, Sarah. The same responsibility that I've carried since before you were born." Sarah studied her father's weathered face, seeing beyond the stoic rancher's exterior to the complex man beneath, a brilliant innovator who had chosen obscurity to protect others, a widower who had raised her alone while carrying the burden of a truth too dangerous to share. "I understand, Pa," she replied, her voice steady. "More than you think." As their horses disappeared down the darkened road, Caleb returned to his workshop. The building that had been his sanctuary for 15 years now served as command center for what was to come. On the workbench lay the components Samuel Whitaker had provided, the final elements needed to complete modifications to the Winchester, that those who had mocked it could never have imagined. Tomorrow, Holloway and his men would discover what happened to those who threatened a Hawkins. Tomorrow, the weapon they had laughed at would demonstrate capabilities that defied conventional expectations. Tomorrow, the crippled veteran would send a message that even hired guns couldn't misinterpret. Caleb worked through the night, his damaged leg protesting but his hands steady, as they had always been when engaged in the precision work that had once defined his life. By dawn, the modifications were complete, transforming the seemingly ordinary Winchester into something that existed at the intersection of art, science, and lethal capability. As the first light broke over Redemption Canyon, Caleb Hawkins stepped onto his porch, the modified Winchester cradled in his arm, his walking stick gripped firmly in his right hand. In the distance, he could see dust rising from the road leading to his property, riders approaching at a gallop, carrying men who believed superior numbers and conventional firearms gave them an advantage. They would soon learn how wrong they were. The morning sun cast long shadows across Caleb Hawkins' property as 7 riders approached along the dusty trail. Dust billowed behind them, creating a haze that seemed to announce their arrival like an advancing storm front. Caleb remained motionless on his porch, the modified Winchester held across his body, his walking stick planted firmly beside him. Through his workshop window, he had watched their approach for the past 15 minutes, analyzing their formation and spacing. The riders maintained precise distances from each other, a cavalry arrangement that confirmed his suspicions about the men. These weren't mere corporate agents, they were military-trained operators, accustomed to patrol procedures. In hostile territory, as the riders halted in a semicircle facing the ranch house, Caleb noted their positioning. The formation provided maximum coverage while establishing clear fields of fire, another indication that these men expected and were prepared for armed resistance. From the lead horse emerged Victor Holloway, his expensive duster barely showing. Dust despite the hard ride. Parker and Reeves flanked him immediately, with 4 additional men spreading out to create a perimeter. All wore gun belts positioned for quick draws, and Caleb spotted the telltale bulges of concealed firearms beneath. Their vests, backup weapons visible only to someone who knew what to look for. Caleb mentally catalogued their armaments. Colt Peacemakers on Parker and 2 others, what appeared to be Smith & Wessons on the remaining men, and something unusual beneath Reeves's jacket, likely a sawed-off shotgun in a specialized shoulder holster. The firepower was significant, but displayed with a subtlety that maintained the fiction that they were merely corporate representatives. "Good morning, Mr. Hawkins," Holloway called out, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced projection. "I see you've been expecting us." Caleb remained silent, his stillness projecting a calm that unsettled the hired guns. Experienced fighters recognized the absence of fear when they saw it. "I hope you've reconsidered our offer," Holloway continued, approaching to the bottom of the porch steps. "After yesterday's conversation, we took the liberty of preparing revised documents that I believe address your concerns." Caleb noted how Parker's hand hovered near his holster, how the perimeter men maintained awareness of potential firing positions around the property. These were professionals, which made what he was about to do all the more necessary. "No documents today," Caleb replied finally, his voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "Just a message." Holloway's practiced smile faltered slightly. "A message?" "About Robert Franklin." The mention of the hospitalized rancher caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Reeves glanced at Parker, a micro-expression of concern crossing his features, before disappearing behind professional composure. "A regrettable incident," Holloway responded smoothly. "I understand Mr. Franklin was involved in an accident." "Our Company has already offered to cover his medical expenses as a gesture of community goodwill. Caleb's expression hardened. Not an accident. I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Hawkins, Holloway replied, a warning edge entering his voice, but accusations without evidence can be problematic. Not here for accusations. Caleb shifted his weight, adjusting his grip on the Winchester, in a motion so subtle it appeared almost casual. Here to demonstrate consequences. Parker stepped forward, his posture shifting from alert to aggressive. That sounds remarkably like a threat, old man. You might want to reconsider your position, given the circumstances. The circumstances were clear. 1 injured veteran against 7 armed men. The odds appeared overwhelming to anyone unfamiliar with Caleb Hawkins' capabilities. 500 yards, Caleb said, gesturing with his walking stick toward the distant fence line where Western Territories had placed survey markers the previous day. Those silver stakes you put on my property, how many do you count? Confused by this apparent non sequitur, Holloway turned to look toward the distant markers, barely visible at the edge of the north pasture. Mr. Hawkins, I don't see how... The Winchester moved with a speed that belied Caleb's disability. In one fluid motion, he raised, aimed, and fired. The sound echoed across the property as the first silver stake disintegrated 500 yards away. Before anyone could react, Caleb worked the lever action and fired again. A second stake disappeared, then a third. The rapidity and precision of the shots froze the hired guns momentarily, professionals recognizing something that defied their training and experience. Parker was the first to recover, his hand moving toward his holstered Colt. Drop the rifle, now. Caleb's fourth shot kicked up dirt directly between Parker's feet, close enough to demonstrate precision, but deliberately avoiding injury. The message was unmistakable. The miss was intentional. A standard Winchester 66 has an effective range of about 200 yards, Caleb stated calmly, the weapon still trained downrange rather than at the men before him. Even with premium ammunition and expert marksmanship, 300 yards is pushing the limits of accuracy. He worked the lever again, the sound distinct in the stunned silence that had fallen over the group. This one's effective at 600 yards with standard ammunition, 800 with custom loads. Each technical term was punctuated by the destruction of another distant marker. Custom rifling pattern, specialized harmonic dampening, proprietary balance, redistribution mechanisms, the same principles I refused to sell 15 years ago when someone tried to acquire them by force. Understanding dawned in Holloway's eyes, recognition that the situation had shifted fundamentally. What had appeared to be a simple intimidation visit against an outmatched rancher had transformed into something far more complex. "Who exactly do you think we are, Mr. Hawkins?" Holloway asked, his tone cautious now. "Not who. What?" Caleb lowered the Winchester slightly. "You're the continuation of something that started before you were involved, the same interests that tried to acquire my research 15 years ago, the same people responsible for my wife's death." This revelation visibly shocked Holloway, suggesting that perhaps he wasn't aware of the full history. Caleb noted this reaction, filing it away as potentially valuable information. "I assure you, Mr. Hawkins, Western Territories development has no connection to whatever tragedy occurred in your past," Holloway insisted, his composure recovering. "We're simply a diversified investment firm with interests in land development and resource extraction. And specialized weapons," Caleb added, watching as Reeves's expression confirmed this additional corporate division. "Convenient combination, acquire the land for its mineral resources while simultaneously obtaining proprietary weapons technology from the rancher who refuses to sell." Parker, who had kept his hand near his holster throughout this exchange, addressed Holloway directly. This is pointless. He's one man. We can end this now and proceed as planned. Caleb's response was to work the lever action again, the sound cutting through Parker's bravado like a knife. You can try. But before your hand clears leather, I'll have put a round through your center mass from a weapon you didn't think could hit at this distance. The confidence with which he delivered this assessment, calm, matter-of-fact, without bravado, created doubt even among these experienced operators. Parker's hand hesitated, hovering near but not reaching for his weapon. "The Franklin Ranch," Caleb continued, addressing Holloway directly. "Tell me who ordered it." Holloway's expression suggested genuine confusion. "I had nothing to do with any attack on—" "Might even be true," Caleb interrupted. "Doesn't matter. You're here representing interests that did, so you'll deliver my message to them." The atmosphere had transformed completely. What had begun as an intimidation visit against a supposedly vulnerable target had become a demonstration of power that shifted the dynamic entirely. The hired guns remained alert but noticeably more cautious, their assessment of the threat level visibly recalibrated. "What message?" Holloway asked finally. 2 days, Caleb stated. 2 days to withdraw completely from Redemption Canyon, to release all option contracts, to compensate the Franklin family for damages and medical expenses. He let the implication hang in the air, waiting with the demonstration of capability they had just witnessed. Holloway studied Caleb with newfound respect and caution. "Even if I could convince my superiors to consider such demands, which I cannot, what guarantee would we have that you wouldn't simply use your unique capabilities against us regardless?" "My word," Caleb replied simply, "which has value, unlike yours." This directness seemed to resonate with Holloway, who recognized the old-fashioned code being invoked. "I'll convey your message, Mr. Hawkins, but I should warn you that my organization doesn't respond well to ultimatums." "Not an ultimatum," Caleb corrected. "A courtesy. Could have demonstrated on your men instead of survey stakes." The implied threat hung in the air, made more potent by the matter-of-fact delivery and the evidence of capability they had just witnessed. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Hawkins," Holloway concluded, gesturing for his men to return to their horses. They departed. Caleb remained on the porch, the Winchester still at the ready. Only when the dust from their horses had settled did he allow himself to ease his posture slightly, the tension in his damaged leg making itself known after the prolonged standing. Inside his ranch house, Caleb placed a call on the telegraph line. He had installed years ago, a precaution that had seemed excessive until now. The message he sent connected him to a man he hadn't contacted in almost a decade, Captain Hargrove. "Stop Caleb Hawkins. Stop situation. Active Redemption Canyon. Stop Sarah will contact you. Stop need confirmation on Western Territories ownership. Stop urgent." Stop while awaiting a response. Caleb turned his attention to preparing for what would inevitably come next. Holloway might deliver his message, but corporate interests of this magnitude rarely retreated because of a single demonstration, no matter how impressive. They would analyze, adapt, and return with a different approach. The afternoon brought Sheriff Rawlins, who pulled up to the ranch in his buckboard wagon with visible concern etched on his features. "Heard there was some excitement this morning," he stated without preamble. "Gunshots reported on your property. Target practice," Caleb replied evenly. "On my own land. Still legal in this territory," Rawlins sighed, removing his hat. "Caleb, I've known you long enough to read between the lines. My deputy spotted Holloway's group leaving your property looking like they'd seen a ghost. What did you do?" "Demonstrated consequences," Caleb answered, continuing his work on a component that Rawlins recognized as part of Caleb's proprietary modification system. "Made my position clear regarding the Franklin situation." "Jesus, Caleb," Rawlins muttered, running a hand through his hair. These aren't local troublemakers. Western Territories has connections at the territorial level, political influence, legal teams that could bury this entire county in paperwork. They also have a specialized weapons division using silver mining as cover for technology appropriation, Caleb countered, setting down his tools to face his old friend directly. This isn't just about land, Eli. It's about what happened 15 years ago. What they tried to take then, what they're trying to take now. Roland's expression shifted from concern to grim understanding. You think it's the same players after all this time? Different front, same interests. Caleb gestured toward his workbench, where components were arranged with precise organization. I've contacted Captain Hargrove at the Territorial Marshal's office. He's looking into Western Territory's corporate structure, particularly their military contracts. Hargrove, Rawlins repeated, recognition in his voice. He was involved after Elizabeth's death, the federal investigation that went nowhere. Caleb nodded once. He knows what's really at stake, what these modifications represent in the wrong hands. Rawlins studied the workshop, taking in the evidence of Caleb's renewed focus on his specialized craft. You're preparing for escalation. They won't walk away, Caleb confirmed. Not after what I demonstrated this morning. They'll analyze, adapt, and return with a different approach. What about Sarah? Is she safe? With Jacob at his cousin's. In place in Silver Peak, Caleb replied, coordinating certain arrangements from there, away from Western Territory's immediate influence. Rawlins nodded, relieved at this precaution at least. Robert Franklin regained consciousness this morning. Confirmed it was 2 men in Western Territory's vests who attacked him. They specifically mentioned his friendship with you as the reason. This confirmation hardened Caleb's resolve further. Robert Franklin was more than a neighbor. He was the closest thing to family Caleb had besides Sarah. The attack was not just business. It was personal. Pressure applied with deliberate cruelty. They're isolating targets, Caleb observed. Standard tactic. Remove support networks before the main assault. Which means you're next, Rawlins concluded, and they won't underestimate you again after this morning. Caleb's expression remained impassive, but his eyes conveyed complete certainty. Counting on it. As afternoon transitioned toward evening, Caleb received a telegram response from Captain Hargrove. Hawkins. Stop information received. Stop Western Territories, subsidiary of Crosswell Weapons, Incorporated. Stop Chairman James Fletcher. Stop arriving Redemption Canyon. Tomorrow stop maintain position. Stop Hargrove stop. The name James Fletcher struck Caleb with unexpected force. Fletcher had been a junior officer in Caleb's cavalry unit during the war, a man who had shown particular interest in Caleb's early rifle modifications. After the war, Fletcher had started a small arms manufacturing company that specialized in military contracts. The connection was now explicit, confirming Caleb's suspicions about the continuity between past and present events. Fletcher wasn't just after silver deposits. He was after the weapons technology he had coveted since the war, innovations that had made Caleb's unit the most effective sharpshooters in the conflict. Shortly after this revelation, another rider approached the ranch. Young Billy Cooper, returning from town with additional intelligence. Western Territories brought in more men, Mr. Hawkins, he reported breathlessly. 15 at least, staying at the Wayfarer Hotel. Town's buzzing about it. They're not even pretending to be businessmen anymore, wearing gun belts openly, intimidating folks on the street. Caleb absorbed this information without visible reaction. Anything else? Yes, sir. A private train car arrived at the station an hour ago. Fancy one, with armed guards. Word is the company chairman himself is coming to oversee operations personally. This confirmed Hargrove's telegram. James Fletcher was taking a direct hand in the situation, a significant escalation that suggested both the value he placed on Caleb's technology and his determination to acquire it by any means necessary. One more thing, Mr. Hawkins, Billy added, his young face serious. "They've been asking about Miss Sarah, where she might have gone. They visited the school, questioned Mrs. Henderson about her." This crossing of an unspoken line hardened Caleb's expression into something that made even Billy, who had known him for years, step back involuntarily. "Thank you, Billy," Caleb said, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "I need you to ride to the Franklin place. Tell Miguel to implement the second arrangement we discussed. He'll understand." As Billy departed, Caleb returned to his workshop to make final preparations. The targeting of Sarah changed everything. What had been a strategic conflict now became deeply personal, a line that James Fletcher should have known better than to cross. From a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, Caleb retrieved something he hadn't touched in 15 years, a cavalry officer's uniform, meticulously preserved. Not his own, but one taken from a Confederate sharpshooter who had nearly killed him at Gettysburg, a man whose rifle had incorporated primitive versions of Caleb's own modifications. Beside the uniform lay a medal Caleb had never claimed or worn, a Medal of Honor awarded for actions during the Battle of Missionary Ridge, where his specialized rifle had allowed him to eliminate Confederate artillery observers at distances considered impossible, saving hundreds of Union lives. These reminders of his past served a tactical purpose now, a message for James Fletcher about shared history and the consequences of resurrecting old conflicts. As darkness fell over Redemption Canyon, the telegraph clicked again with a message from Sarah. "Father, stop arrangements complete, stop. Captain Hargrove confirms special jurisdiction. Stop Reynolds sending supplies tomorrow. Stop Jacob returning with news. Stop stay safe. Stop Sarah, stop." The pieces were falling into place. Captain Hargrove's special jurisdiction meant federal authority that superseded local limitations, authority that would protect Caleb's actions in the coming confrontation from legal consequences. Outside, a storm was building on the horizon. Lightning, illuminating the gathering clouds in brief, brilliant flashes. The symbolism wasn't lost on Caleb. A storm was indeed coming to Redemption Canyon, one that had been brewing for 15 years. On his workbench lay the fully modified Winchester, alongside specialized ammunition he had crafted through the night. Tomorrow, James Fletcher would discover what happened when ambition crossed into vengeance. Tomorrow, the weapon that had been mocked by hired guns would demonstrate capabilities that would rewrite the future of warfare. Tomorrow, the crippled veteran would settle a debt 15 years overdue. Caleb worked late into the night, preparing not just weapons, but a strategy that would force a final resolution. By dawn, everything was in place. As the first rays of morning light crept over the eastern hills, he stepped onto his porch one final time, the modified Winchester in his hands, his walking stick left behind. Some confrontations required no crutch, only steady hands and the conviction that justice, too long delayed, would finally be served. A blood-red dawn painted Redemption Canyon in crimson and gold as a private carriage rolled down the main street, flanked by mounted guards whose military bearing was unmistakable despite their civilian attire. Townspeople peered anxiously through windows as the procession halted before the Jenkins building, where Western Territories had established their headquarters. From the carriage emerged a distinguished man in his mid-60s, silver-haired and ramrod straight, despite his years. James Fletcher's bearing reflected his military background, a commander accustomed to unquestioned authority. His tailored suit and gleaming boots spoke of wealth, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a strategist assessing a battlefield. Inside the Jenkins building, Victor Holloway awaited with visible apprehension. The demonstration at the Hawkins Ranch had transformed a straightforward acquisition into something far more complex, and Fletcher's unexpected personal appearance confirmed. "The operation's elevated importance, sir," Holloway greeted, standing as Fletcher entered the makeshift office. We weren't expecting you until after you'd secured both the property and the technology, Fletcher interrupted, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education overlaid with the hard edge of command. Instead, I arrived to find our surveyors chased off, our negotiations at a standstill, and Hawkins not only aware of our interest in his modifications, but actively demonstrating their effectiveness against our personnel. Fletcher moved to the window, gazing out at the town with the practiced eye of a man who saw assets rather than community. 15 years, Victor. 15 years I've waited for confirmation that Hawkins survived and continued his work. 15 years tracking rumors of impossible shots made by ranchers throughout 3 territories. Sir, if I may, Holloway ventured cautiously. Hawkins mentioned his wife's death, implied a connection to our company. Fletcher turned, his expression unreadable. Ancient history, corporate predecessors made unfortunate decisions. Overzealous agents exceeded their authority. Nothing connected to our current operations. The practice deflection suggested rehearsal, a narrative constructed to maintain plausible deniability. What matters now is acquisition. Where do we stand? Parker stepped forward, his military background evident in his stance. We've consolidated our position in town. 24 operators positioned strategically. The sheriff's jurisdiction has been effectively neutralized. He has 2 deputies and limited influence beyond the town limits. And Hawkins, Fletcher asked, isolated at his ranch. The daughter has disappeared, likely fled to a neighboring settlement. We have men watching all roads. Hawkins himself hasn't left his property since yesterday's demonstration, which you failed to record in your report, Fletcher observed coldly. Exactly what capability did he demonstrate? Parker shifted uncomfortably. 500-yard. Precision with a supposedly standard Winchester. Multiple consecutive hits on targets barely visible to the naked eye. Speed and accuracy that defies conventional ballistics. Fletcher's expression transformed, a hunger replacing the corporate mask. The harmonic stabilization system. He's perfected it. He turned to Holloway. Your negotiation approach has failed. We implement the alternative acquisition protocol. Immediately. Sir, Holloway objected, that would exceed our legal considerations are secondary, Fletcher cut him off. The technology Hawkins possesses will revolutionize military contracts worldwide. Its value exceeds the entire silver deposit by orders of magnitude. I want that rifle, those modifications, and his research journal secured before sunset. And Hawkins himself? Parker asked. Fletcher's expression hardened. A tragic accident. Another oil lamp explosion, perhaps. History repeating itself. The coldly delivered death sentence silenced the room. Whatever pretense of legitimate business had existed was now abandoned, replaced by naked acquisition through elimination. Prepare your men, Fletcher ordered. We move within the hour. Miles away, across rolling grasslands now gilded by morning, Light Sheriff Eli Rawlins rode hard toward the Hawkins ranch, his horse lathered from the punishing pace. Reaching the yard, he dismounted before his animal had fully stopped. "Caleb," he called, striding toward the porch where his old friend sat, seemingly relaxed, the modified Winchester across his lap. "You got company coming?" Rawlins reported, grimly. Fletcher arrived on the morning train with additional men. They're mobilizing, at least 20 heading this way. This isn't a negotiation party. Caleb nodded, unsurprised. James always preferred direct action when diplomacy failed. He gestured toward the horizon. Expected him yesterday, actually. He's losing his edge. Rawlins studied his friend with concern. This isn't a cavalry skirmish, Caleb. They're coming in force, with orders to secure your technology by any means necessary. I know, Caleb replied, rising with a fluid motion that belied his disability. That's why I chose the battlefield. For the first time, Rawlins noticed the subtle changes to the property, slight adjustments to fence lines, relocated water troughs, newly positioned equipment. What had appeared to be a vulnerable ranch was, to the trained eye, a carefully prepared defensive position. "You're outmanned 20-1, Rawlins protested. Caleb's smile held no humor. "Numbers don't matter when you control range and visibility." He handed Rawlins a sealed envelope. "This contains signed affidavits from Robert Franklin regarding his attack, documentation of Western Territory's illegal operations, and evidence linking Fletcher to similar operations in 2 other territories." "Insurance?" Rawlins asked, tucking the envelope inside his vest. "Justice," Caleb corrected, "regardless of today's outcome. Captain Hargrove has men positioned in Silver Peak, awaiting your telegram." Rawlins recognized the strategy. Caleb was ensuring that even if he didn't survive the coming confrontation, Fletcher wouldn't escape consequences. "You should leave," Caleb continued. "What happens next isn't for a lawman to witness officially." Rawlins hesitated, loyalty warring with duty. "This badge doesn't cancel 15 years of friendship, Caleb." "No," Caleb agreed, "but it limits how you can help. I need you in town watching for reinforcements, protecting civilians if this spills beyond my property." The logic was sound, if unwelcome. Rawlins extended his hand. "When this is over, I expect a full explanation of how that rifle does what you claim." Caleb clasped his friend's hand firmly. "When this is over, I'll build you one of your own." As Rawlins departed, Caleb returned to his workshop for final preparations. From a specially designed case, he removed custom ammunition, cartridges, whose internal composition had been modified through techniques only he fully understood. Each round contained precisely weighted powder charges and specially shaped bullets that, when fired through his modified rifling pattern, achieved ballistic performance considered theoretically impossible. He loaded the Winchester methodically, then placed additional ammunition in specific locations throughout the property, strategic caches positioned for accessibility during extended engagement. From a hidden compartment, he retrieved his cavalry spyglass, an instrument he had modified with the same principles applied to his rifle sights. Through it, he surveyed the approach to his property. Dust on the horizon confirmed Rawlins' warning. Riders, approaching in formation, still miles distant, but moving with purpose. Inside the ranch house, Caleb activated the telegraph he had installed years earlier, a precaution now proving its worth. His message to Sarah was brief. "Engagement imminent, stop Fletcher protocol activated. Stop Captain Hargrove advised. Stop stay in Silver Peak stop." Farther stop with communications complete, Caleb positioned himself not on the porch, where Fletcher's men would expect him, but in a carefully prepared location 300 yards from the main approach, a shallow depression offering concealment while maintaining clear fields of fire in all directions. The waiting was familiar, the calm before engagement, that Caleb had experienced countless times during the war. His damaged leg, usually a constant reminder of past violence, felt strangely painless now, as if his body recognized the need for complete focus on the coming confrontation. Through his spyglass, he watched Fletcher's men approach, noting their deployment pattern with professional assessment. They moved in a standard pincer formation, main force approaching directly while flanking elements circled to cut off potential retreat routes. At their center rode James Fletcher himself, his silver hair unmistakable even at distance. Caleb allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Fletcher's personal presence confirmed the value he placed on the modified Winchester, valuable enough to risk his own safety rather than directing operations remotely. It was both arrogance and desperation, a combination that created exploitable vulnerabilities. The riders halted at the boundary of Caleb's property, just as he had anticipated. Parker deployed men in a standard perimeter, with sharpshooters taking elevated positions on nearby rises. Fletcher, Holloway, and 6 guards approached the ranch house directly, clearly expecting to find Caleb waiting on his porch as before. Their confusion upon finding the house apparently deserted was evident even from Caleb's distant position. Fletcher gestured sharply, sending men to check the workshop and outbuildings while the main group maintained position near the house. The systematic search proceeded exactly as Caleb had planned, drawing Fletcher's forces into increasingly exposed positions as they expanded their search perimeter. Within minutes, they had spread across his property in predictable patterns. Their attention focused on structures rather than the surrounding landscape. It was time. The first shot from Caleb's Winchester took everyone by surprise, not aimed at any person, but at the large dinner bell hanging beside the ranch house porch. The bell exploded into fragments, the sound echoing across the property like a signal. Before Fletcher's men could identify the shot's origin, Caleb had already relocated, moving 30 yards through concealed paths to a secondary position. His second shot disabled the telegraph wire leading to the ranch house, cutting Fletcher's communication options without harming any person. The precision demonstration had its intended effect. Fletcher's men scattered for cover, suddenly aware they faced a sharpshooter whose position they couldn't pinpoint and whose accuracy made conventional tactics ineffective. Through his spyglass, Caleb observed Fletcher himself, not hiding but scanning the property with the calculated assessment of a former cavalry officer. Unlike his men, Fletcher understood exactly what he was facing. "Hawkins," Fletcher called out, his voice carrying across the property with parade ground projection. "Is this how you greet an old comrade, shooting from concealment?" Caleb's third shot kicked up dirt precisely 5 feet in front of Fletcher, close enough to demonstrate intent without causing injury. "Not a comrade," Caleb replied, his voice carried by the wind rather than revealing his position. "Never were." Fletcher turned toward the sound, though Caleb had already moved again. "We served together, fought together. Your modifications saved a unit at Missionary Ridge. Before you tried to steal them," Caleb countered from a new position. "Before your agents killed my wife trying to get my research." Fletcher spread his hands in a gesture of conciliation. "Unfortunate misunderstandings, overzealous subordinates, ancient history now. Not to me." Caleb's fourth shot severed the reins of Fletcher's horse, causing the animal to startle, but remaining under Fletcher's control, another demonstration of precision that unnerved the watching men. "What do you want, Hawkins?" Fletcher demanded, his diplomatic facade cracking. "Under pressure. Money, recognition, name your price." "Justice," Caleb replied. "Leave Redemption Canyon permanently. Release all land claims. Compensate those you've injured." Fletcher laughed, the sound carrying no humor. "You're still the idealist. Still. Don't understand the bigger picture. Your modifications could change the balance of power between nations, worth millions to the right military contracts. Not for sale. Not to you. Not to anyone." Fletcher's expression hardened. "Then you leave me no choice." He signaled to Parker, who immediately relayed orders to the deployed men. They began coordinating movements, attempting to triangulate Caleb's position through sound. "Last chance. Hawkins," Fletcher called out, "surrender your research and modifications. We can still resolve this without bloodshed." Caleb's response was to fire a fifth shot, this one shattering the pocket watch chain visible at Fletcher's vest. The demonstration of pinpoint accuracy at hunting ranges sent an unmistakable message. Fletcher was alive by choice, not necessity. Fletcher's facade of negotiation vanished entirely. "Take him," he ordered sharply. "The rifle and research journal. Our primary objectives. Hawkins himself is expendable." The hired guns advanced in coordinated pairs, using cover techniques that confirmed their military training. Under normal circumstances, against a conventional opponent, their approach would have been effective. Against Caleb's modified Winchester, and strategic preparation, they were walking into a carefully orchestrated demonstration. For the next 20 minutes, Caleb engaged in what could only be described as a masterclass in defensive sharpshooting. Each shot disabled weapons without harming men. A revolver blown from a hand at 400 yards, ammunition belts severed at critical moments, hat brims shot away as warnings against further advance. The psychological impact was devastating. Fletcher's men, accustomed to overwhelming firepower advantages, found themselves systematically disarmed by an opponent they couldn't locate, using a weapon that shouldn't have been capable of such accuracy. Through his spyglass, Caleb watched frustration transform Fletcher's expression. The corporate executive vanished, replaced by the calculating cavalry officer Caleb remembered from the war, a man who recognized when tactical retreat was necessary. Fletcher signaled to his remaining men, ordering consolidation around his position. The message was clear. They were withdrawing to reconsider their approach. Caleb allowed them this temporary reprieve, watching as they gathered their disarmed colleagues and prepared to retreat. As they mounted their horses, Fletcher remained behind momentarily, scanning the property with narrowed eyes. "This isn't over, Hawkins," he called out. "You can't protect your secrets forever." "Not trying to," Caleb replied from yet another position. "Already secured." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Fletcher's face. "What do you mean?" "Complete documentation delivered to Captain Michael Hargrove, Territorial Marshal's office," Caleb explained. "My modifications, research journal, manufacturing specifications, all secured in federal evidence with instructions for public release." The implications struck Fletcher visibly. The technology he had coveted for 15 years, that he had built corporate divisions anticipating, was now potentially public domain. "You're bluffing," Fletcher asserted, though his tone lacked conviction. Caleb's response was to fire a final shot, this one striking the ground directly between Fletcher's feet. "Test that theory at your peril. Leave Redemption Canyon. Release all claims. Compensate the injured. Or watch your military contracts become worthless when every gunsmith in the territory can replicate my modifications." The standoff held for several heartbeats, corporate ambition warring with tactical reality. Finally, Fletcher mounted his horse with the stiff dignity of a man acknowledging defeat without verbally surrendering. "This territory's changing, Hawkins," he said as parting shot. "Men like you, independent, refusing progress, you're already relics." "Perhaps," Caleb acknowledged. "But this relic just sent 20 armed men running with a single rifle and principle." Fletcher had no response to this undeniable truth. With a sharp gesture to his remaining men, he turned his horse and rode away, dust rising behind the retreating column like a banner of defeat. Caleb maintained his vigilance until the riders disappeared over the horizon, then slowly made his way back to his ranch house. His damaged leg, ignored during the confrontation, now throbbed with renewed intensity, the physical cost of tactical movement after years of accommodated living. Inside, he telegraphed Sarah. "Engagement concluded. Stop Fletcher. Retreating stop. Situation contained. Stop return. When Captain Hargrove confirms. Stop Father Stop." The reply came within minutes. "Father Stop. Captain Hargrove confirms Western Territories departing. Stop federal warrants issued for assault on Franklin. Stop returning. Tomorrow. With Jacob. Stop documents secured. As instructed. Stop proud of you. Stop Sarah Stop." The following days brought confirmation of Fletcher's complete withdrawal from Redemption Canyon. Land claims were released, option contracts cancelled, and compensation delivered to Robert Franklin, who was recovering slowly but steadily under Doc Bennett's care. Captain Michael Hargrove arrived personally to document the modified Winchester and Caleb's research, not to confiscate them, but to ensure their protection under federal oversight while honoring Caleb's wishes regarding their limited application. "You could have sold this for millions," Hargrove observed as Caleb demonstrated the harmonic stabilization system. Military contracts alone would have made you wealthier than Fletcher. Some innovations aren't meant for battlefields, Caleb replied, adjusting the sight alignment with practiced precision. The applications for disabled veterans, for hunters feeding families through difficult winters, that's legacy enough. Sarah returned to find her father changed, not dramatically, but subtly transformed by the resolution of a 15-year shadow. The secrets revealed, justice served, however imperfectly, had lifted a weight from Caleb Hawkins that had bent but never broken him. 1 week after Fletcher's departure, Sheriff Rawlins joined them for dinner at the ranch house, the first social gathering Caleb had hosted since Elizabeth's death. As Sarah served coffee on the porch afterward, Rawlins studied his old friend with newfound appreciation. "Those hired guns in town are still talking about it," he remarked. "The crippled rancher with the ancient Winchester who outshot 20, and without hitting a single one. You're becoming a legend, Caleb." "Legends are for campfire tales," Caleb replied. "I'm just a rancher with a modified rifle, and the most extraordinary shooting skills in 3 territories," Sarah added with quiet pride. "Skills I'm considering sharing more widely," Caleb said, the statement surprising both his listeners. "Been thinking about Fletcher's parting words, about being a relic. Perhaps it's time my modifications benefited others who need them. What are you considering?" Rawlins asked. Caleb gestured toward his workshop. "Limited instruction, veterans with disabilities who need specialized modifications, hunters supporting families, not military, not hired guns, people who need accuracy for legitimate purposes." Sarah's expression brightened. "The school board has been asking about vocational training options. We could establish a proper program, selective admission, ethical guidelines." The conversation continued as sunset painted Redemption Canyon in gold and shadow. On the porch of the ranch he had protected, surrounded by family and friends he had nearly lost, Caleb Hawkins contemplated a future where his innovations served life rather than death, where the ancient Winchester that Outlaws had mocked became a symbol of precision and purpose rather than deadly capability. The weapon they had laughed at had demonstrated its true potential. The veteran they had underestimated had protected an entire community, and the legacy of both would continue, not as instruments of destruction, but as tools of precision for those who needed them most. In the distance, thunder rumbled as another storm approached Redemption Canyon. But unlike the storms of weeks past, this one brought only cleansing rain, nourishment for the land, and promise for the future, washing away the last traces of conflict from a territory that had earned its name at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.